Welcome to our special dialogue segment on See Today Business. Today we're going to be talking about Indonesia's economy, its prospects, especially for the business sector. Now, we're going to be discussing that with Mr. Alessandro Gazzini. He's the Managing Director and Country Head of Indonesia of Alvarez and Marsal. It's a restructuring and turnaround company. Mr. Alessandro, or Mr. Alex?
Yes,
if it's
Alex
okay
is fine. Thank you.
Right.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for speaking to us about this. Now, of course, Indonesia's economy has been performing quite well, especially in the challenges of the pandemic. The IMF called it a bright spot. Now, let's take a look at the graphics of Indonesia's growth from 2021. If you can, as you can see, the recovery has been quite well. Second quarter of 2021, it was at 7% growth. There was a slight drop in the first quarter of 2022, but overall, it's been above 5% in the last few quarters. So just talk to us. What do you see as the prospect of Indonesia's economy, especially for businesses at the moment?
I would say I couldn't agree more. I think a bright spot or a great place to be. Actually, you were talking IMF projections. It's looking to close at 5% this year, all right? And actually, with the exception of India, which is given to grow higher, most other economies are given to grow negative or lower their growth. So Indonesia is maintaining its place as a bright spot for this year and next year.
Right, and of course, Indonesia is aiming to be the fourth largest economy by 2045. Let's look at the next graphics now. As you can see, growth has been quite stable. Aside from the pandemic in 2020, since 2016, growth has been above 5%. Regarding Indonesia's sort of target to become the fourth largest economy by 2045, do you see this as is it possible, and what do you think are the challenges there?
So as an aspiration, right, it's definitely possible, and I think it's achievable. Of course, on condition of certain more structural reforms. Because if you take the data from Bappenas, right, the projection is to reach that aspiration, we need to grow at 6.5 to 7.5 GDP growth a year. So the question is, how do we lift from our 5% steady cruising to go to overdrive at 7%, right? Which was also the original plan of the president, right? Right. And you'd have to start thinking about more structural reforms, like pillar number one for me would be around how do we step change talent, right? We need simply many more engineers and scientists and R&D in the country, right? So the talent pool has to be absolutely increased and accelerated very fast to support the businesses and growth.
Right. Do you see that as a major problem right now in terms of
major challenge?
Right.
And if we unlock that, then that underlying talent and a knowledge base will support a higher GDP growth, right?
Okay. So let's look at more detail into the different sectors. If you can take a look at the next graphics. This is growth rate by industry in 2022. High growth in transportation and storage sector. Manufacturing and mining also above 4%. I mean, just talk to us about the different sectors that you have worked with as well, which have had the highest prospects here.
Well, anything, as I said, anything that's tying back to the structural positive pillars of the country and including consumer spending would be number one. So anything consumer goods, healthcare, for example, where they are, in healthcare's case, it's underserved, right? So there's so much more to do, whether from hospital networks or medical device systems or pharma production domestically in Indonesia. It's an open field. There's much to do still, and the need is so strong, and the spending is there, right? Obviously, other interesting sectors are around, and this is a government priority on the infrastructure side. Much has been done, and by infrastructure, I don't only mean transportation infrastructure, right? Yeah. I'd be looking at opportunities around port management, airport management, which the government intends to also not only liberalize, but provide concessions for private players to operate these assets, right? But also digital infrastructure. This is all the digital network of the country. We're underpenetrated on fiber.
Yeah.
So the whole digital infrastructure is a big opportunity going forward.
So you were talking about digital infrastructure. Let's talk about the digital economy. Of course, it has been booming in Indonesia, but there are some challenges, for example, not just in Indonesia, but around the world with interest rates going up. What are some of the problems that sort of businesses in the digital economy are facing right now?
Well, what's happening globally, and then if we look, the same things are playing out in Indonesia, right? Essentially, in the high inflation, high interest rate environment, cost of capital is very high. So when cost of capital was 1%, investing it into startups was relatively easy. Right. Now that cost of capital is above 5%, the funding has dried up.
Right.
If you look at the private equity and venture capital funding globally, it's drying up, right? Now they still have cash to invest, right? But the returns that the startups need to guarantee against that cash have to be so much higher now, right?
Yeah.
So the whole digital economy / startup world, I think, will inevitably have a bit of a shakedown, right? All the companies that are not producing positive operational cash will be in difficulty, because as soon as they need new funding rounds, they'll discover that funding is very hard to get, right? So that means there probably is going to be a consolidation of the sector as well. But again, the underlying growth and the underlying need is there.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a shakedown and then a stabilization situation.
Right, so you're saying right now investors are not really investing into startups and sort of digital economy businesses. How long do you think that's going to last?
I wouldn't say not. I would say they're a lot more cautious and careful, right, in deploying the capital, right, compared to a year or 2 or 3 years ago. From what I see and try to understand, they're saying that it all depends on inflation, really, right? IMF and other sources are talking about a restabilization of inflation won't happen till 2025, right? It has come down now, but it's still structurally high if you compare it to the target of 2%, which central banks typically have, all right? So at least a year and a half or 2, we're gonna have this difficult environment. So any companies that will need new funding will find it extremely challenging. Any companies that have over-leveraged balance sheets will find the situation extremely challenging as well, right, in the next 2 years.
I want to touch upon the private equity industry. Do you see that kind of slowing down in Indonesia?
Definitely. You can also see it already in the numbers. And they're talking about, and the numbers that are coming up in 2023 talks about at least a 50% decline of investments deployed of the private equity capital. Let's remember that the private equity capital globally is easily up to 40% of global investments. So it's a very big portion of the investments. And they have cash, but they're just not deploying it as aggressively as they were before, right?
Okay, now speaking of challenges, of course, as we know, Indonesia will sort of undergo presidential elections next year. What kind of challenges do you see, especially for the business sector, amid those elections?
So I can talk historically because I've been, in the country for 26 years. I've seen a few elections, and I was actually surprised that at this round, the business activity, despite the global difficult context, it's been pretty stable. So it's still coming through despite the elections. Typically in the past, what you would find is a very clear slowdown during election period. So that's signaling to me also that it's been quite stable. People are not expecting radical challenges during this electoral period so far. The general feeling is the political stability the president has and the government has ensured is expected to continue even during the electoral period. So people are still slower, but still making investments, still making bets, and still initiating projects as far as I see now.
All right, now let's just quickly sum it up. First, you were talking about the prospect of Indonesia's economy, but there are some challenges. So, what's it going to look like for the next 2 to 3 years in Indonesia's economy and the business sector?
Again, I reiterate, I think we're in a bright spot.
Yeah.
I mean, every other, China's struggling. And Southeast Asia, again, Indonesia is where you want to be, right, essentially. So that's all good. I think my biggest concern is on the private sector and companies in general, is with this high interest rate environment, the ball game has really changed. The previous years, the biggest attention and focus was grow, grow, grow. That was objective number one. Now I would say you have to be very, very careful because if you have overextended balance sheets or if you need new capital to fund your business, you have to be very careful and cautious because many are struggling. Just to give you a data point, we did a research on distressed companies. It's a proprietary research we do globally, and in Indonesia we've concluded. The way we see it is at 2022 and 23, first half, 15% of all listed companies would be already distressed, right? And roughly another 20% have stretched balance sheets. So in terms of a temperature check, right? That's 30 to 35% of total listed companies that have balance sheet or business operations distress situations. And as the reality of more uncertainty, look at Israel, supply chains, interest rates, trading difficulties between countries, it's quite a challenge that they need to manage now. So I would say no longer growth, but be careful of your cash, be careful of your balance sheet, don't overextend in the next year and a half.
All right, so some challenges lay ahead, especially with many uncertain issues or conditions happening worldwide, geopolitical tensions, as you mentioned. But also, as you mentioned, fundamentals are good in Indonesia.
Definitely.
All right, Mr. Alessandro Gazzini, Managing Director and Country Head Indonesia of Alvarez & Marsal. Thank you so much for giving us your insights.
Thank you. Terima kasih.
Thank you. And that was my dialogue with Alessandro Gazzini, Managing Director and Country Head Indonesia from Alvarez & Marsal. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again next time. Thank you so much, Alex.